are incredibly excited to celebrate our amazing friend and colleague, Professor Genevieve Clutario. So this promises to be a really extraordinary event. And we're also really, really excited to have the artist, this amazing artist, Jeanne Jalandoni, who we don't oftentimes get the opportunity to have a conversation about the art, right, that is featured on our books. And for those of us who write books, the art tells a story about the book that we've written. And it's so important to us what gets put, because that becomes the face of our work. So I'm really excited that, Genevieve came up with this idea of actually being in conversation with Jeanne, because it's just kind of emphasizes not only the importance of art in Genevieve's work, right, but the very specific importance of Jeanne's art, right, to the field of Filipinx studies, American studies, and Asian American studies. So with that, I'm going to give you a really brief intro to both of our guests. Jeanne Jalandoni is a painter and textile artist born and based in New York City. She received her BFA in studio art from NYU. Some of her solo shows include exhibitions with Tamor Grand Projects, Real Artways, and the Berkshire Art Museum. She has also exhibited in group shows with Jeffrey Deitch, Ben Brown Fine Arts, and Asia Society Texas Center. Jeanne has been an artist in residence at 36 Chase and Barnes, the Textile Art Center, and Cha North Artist Residency. Other notable achievements and awards include the Real Art Award and the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council Creative Engagement Grant, and a feature in New American Paintings. If Jeanne was not an artist, she would be in a punk band, because she was obsessed with the Ramones when she was in middle school.
Yeah, totally.
Genevieve Clutario is Associate Professor of American Studies here at Wellesley College, where we lured her away from Harvard. She is the author of Beauty Regimes, A History of Power and Modern Empire in the Philippines, 1898 to 1941, and is a recipient of the Duke University Press Scholars of Color First Book Award and the Weatherhead East Asian Institute at Columbia University First Book Award.
Hey.
Her research and teaching interests focus on Asian American narratives and global perspectives, comparative histories of culture and modern empire, transnational feminisms, and gender, race, and the politics of fashion and beauty. Professor Clutario and I bonded over our very, very deep love of smutty romance novels.
Yeah. The smuttier, the better.
Exactly, the smuttier, the better. Please help me welcome my guests.
Thank you for that warm introduction. And thank you so much to the Newhouse Center, especially to the co-directors, Irene Mata and Julie Walsh, for their generosity and their enthusiastic support for a conversation between author and artist. And a huge thanks to Lauren Cote, whose incredible skills and almost unreal capacity to execute vision is truly amazing. For the folks who are here in person and online, family, my kid is here, my partner is here, hi, Jeanne's family is here, and partner is here. To our friends, colleagues, and students, we thank you for joining us this evening. For those of you who are online, I feel really bad because you're not getting to eat the food that smells really good. We have some Filipino food here, and we're really lucky. Okay. So when I approached the Newhouse last year to ask if we could do something a little bit different from a traditional book launch and described what first began as a pretty informal but very enthusiastic conversation between Jeanne and I to present our work together, the previous director, Eve Ziverman, wholeheartedly encouraged the idea. This year's directors, Irene and Julie, championed the idea of an event that would celebrate the publication of my first book, the creation of what I truly believe is the most beautiful and provocative book cover ever to have exist, and the exhibition of new and exciting original work by the incredibly talented Jeanne Jalandoni. It was just really I don't know, it's sort of like we dreamed up this thing and we just kept dreaming big. And Julie and Eden were like, go for it, do it. This is exciting. And we wanted to do an event that would highlight how and why we each narrate Filipinx stories and histories, the ways that beauty, aesthetics, and intimacies become key themes and lenses for us to tell these narratives. And we felt that October was really important because October is Filipino American History Month. So, Jeanne, I had followed your work mostly through Instagram and became an instant fan, especially when I saw a photo of under the same mosquito net, and I think you're going to talk about that later. And that's how I became aware of your work while I was writing the book. And it was like, I think it was like during kind of the height of COVID, and I was really like disconnected from people. But when I saw a photo of your work, I felt reconnected to my family. My family was really far. They were all like on the West Coast or the Philippines. And I felt like, I actually was really taken aback how emotional your art made me feel. And it was just a photograph of your art. And I felt like you had insight into my own past, my own family, and my own Filipino-American experience. And actually, it was a mutual friend of ours, Ashanti Shi. I don't know if folks remember Ashanti. Ashanti, who formally introduced us. So Ashanti was a postdoctoral fellow here at Wellesley, and we were here at the New House chatting after an event, and I was telling Ashanti, was like, oh, how's book publication going? I was like, oh, girl, I gotta do a book cover. What do I do? And then she was like, you should meet Jeanne. And I was like, I follow Jeanne on Instagram, and I was like such a fangirl. And then Ashanti was like, no, I'll introduce you. And so that's kind of how it started. So it's sort of apropos that we are celebrating here at the New House where that sort of first moment happened. And because this is a little bit different from a traditional academic talk, I think it might be useful for us to have a little roadmap of what we're going to do for the rest of the night. So we had some food, everybody's eating, everybody's happy. And then we're going to, Jeanne and I are going to talk about our respective works sort of individually, and then we're going to move into a conversation about the themes of our work, how they're in conversation with one another, kind of how we collaborated. And then if there's time, we will open it up to Q&A. But the incentive at the end of this thing is that there's a surprise. It has to do with food at the end. So we might not have time for a Q&A because the surprise food at the end is actually very important. Okay, So I'll go ahead and just sort of start us off. And I actually didn't want to talk about my book, and then my husband was like, "Not everybody has read your book yet, so you have to talk about it. It's about your book." So to start us off, I will read a few snippets from Beauty Regimes. So on February 24th, 1938, a popular Manila-based magazine published a feature on an 18-year-old Gia Balmori. The title of the article says, "A queen is crowned. Gia Balmori, daughter of a Manila labor leader, crowned Gia I, Miss Philippines and Queen of the Philippine Exposition." The article provided an intimate look at how the beauty queen was made publicly presentable. Balmori appeared smiling and serene after winning a cutthroat competition that included soliciting votes and sponsorships. Balmori defeated other young women contestants from all over the Philippines, earning the much-coveted title of Miss Philippines. Balmori's coronation was the climactic spectacle of the 1938 Philippine Exposition. The article begins early in the morning on the day of the pageant, documenting the behind-the-scenes process of becoming a beauty queen. Alongside a full-length photograph of Balmori adorned in her coronation regalia, the article offers a detailed description of Balmori's terno, a formal gown consisting of a floor-length skirt with a long train and matching bodice, and its most recognizable feature, the butterfly sleeves. Lucy May San Pablo Burns aptly refers to this type of gown as an overprivileged icon of ideal womanhood and of the mother nation, symbolizing feminized demure and upper-class Filipinas. Designer Ramon Valera along with an unacknowledged team of seamstresses and embroiderers, created Balmore's dramatic garment and hand-sewed gold and green sequins and rhinestones that created a stalactite effect on the skirt, long train, and standing collar. And the article goes on to detail Balmore's beauty regimen as she prepared for her public appearance by a crew of hairstylists and makeup technicians who flex their skills. A professional hairstylist meticulously curls and pins Balmore's hair. A deft Max Factor beautician artfully pencils in eyebrows, applies lipsticks, and flicks on a last dusting of face powder. Balmore's public face requires the work and expertise of many. These beauty workers labor toward the moment when Balmore stands regal in all her splendor outside of her well-to-do ermita home. There, the reina greets her public. In many ways, the long article on Balmore substantiates what historian Ambeth Ocampo calls the Filipino obsession with beauty pageants. Referring to the pervasiveness of beauty pageants across barrios, towns, and regions in the Philippines and throughout the diaspora that have developed into a mainstay of Filipino life. In 1994, Philippine Secretary of Tourism Vicente J. Carlos declared, "Beauty contestants are part of Filipino culture. They say if you want anything to succeed in the Philippines, hold a beauty pageant or a cockfight." Just a decade later, the Philippines swept 2 out of 4 titles in the Big 4 international beauty pageants, Miss Universe, Miss World, Miss International, and Miss Earth, making the Philippines the only Asian country to have multiple title winners in all 4 categories in 1 year. In 2015, Pia Wurtzbach won the Miss Universe title. This was followed by Catriona Gray's Miss Universe victory in 2018, and most recently, Filipino-American Arbany Gabriel. News pieces and social media show a staggering number of Filipino fans, including myself, dedicated to these beauty queens and also to the industry itself. Beyond the large international pageant circuit, which features mainly young, single, able-bodied, cisgender women who embody a very narrow definition of beauty ideals, there is also what Emmanuel David calls the larger constellation of Filipino gay, bakla, and transgender beauty pageants. And there are beauty pageants for overseas domestic workers in places like Hong Kong and Milan, just to kind of give you an idea of the pervasiveness of beauty pageants in everyday life. But what can we gain by taking beauty seriously? My book, Beauty Regimes, does just that. It tracks the emotional, physical, and financial investments in Filipino beauty productions. By beauty production, I mean the products made by Filipinas, the performances of beauty, and the strategies to control and define beauty. Indeed, it takes power to declare that something is beautiful. So through the prism of beauty, Beauty Regimes looks at the years between 1898 and 1941, a time of overlapping empires, and it's during these years that colonial power shifted between Spanish, American, and Japanese control. These years marked rapid change that heightened the desire to structure and enforce social order, and this time of overlapping empires and the repeated denial of Philippine national independence. Filipina beauty developed into a highly charged political, economic, and cultural force at the center of global change. So the book isn't an exhaustive history of Filipino beauty and fashion. It's not an exhaustive history of Filipino nationalism or US empire. What it is a story that takes into account both formal and informal responses to structures of authority, one that uncovers connections and relationships between seemingly disconnected people and institutions. And what I really wanted to do was interrogate what we mean by legacies of colonialism in Asian American studies. So just to kind of give you an idea of what I mean by legacies of colonialism, the stories of colonialism, I'm going to tell you a story from my book that has to do with pettiness. I'm a Scorpio, so that says a lot. So in the spring of 1901, a prominent family in Bacolod hosted a lavish feast, much like ours, for members of the Second Philippine Commission and their entourage. In the colonial record, the family and Filipinos in attendance remained unnamed. This event was one of many colonial encounters in the forms of balls, banquets, and afternoon teas held across the Philippine archipelago at the turn of the century. But these social forms were already common practices in the Philippines, even prior to the Americans coming. Throughout the 19th century, Filipinos of means held regularly lavish social events such as bailes and banquets. 2 years into the racial and physical violence that characterized the Philippine-American War, the Philippine Commission capitalized on the norms of the Philippine social landscape in its effort to establish a civil government and end anti-colonial resistance. So in well-appointed ballrooms with feasts laid out under the glowing hanging lanterns, guests sized each other up. The social events became battlegrounds of another kind. Sometimes the encounters became confrontations. In one situation, a Visayan woman at this party that I had mentioned approached a woman named Mabel Leroy, the wife of the man who served as the secretary to William H. Taft. Taft was like head of the Philippine Commission, and later he would become president, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so this Visayan woman pointedly asked Mabel Leroy and the ladies in attendance why the American women had not brought their diamond tiaras and necklaces with them. The question underscored the sartorial differences between Filipino and American women. Wealthy Visayan women wore elaborate gowns made from luxurious materials and were bedecked with jewelry of gold and diamonds, while American women wore much simpler dresses and little to no jewelry. The contrast in sartorial styles and the pointed questions about appearance. Oh no, I lost my place. Okay. So the contrast in sartorial styles and the pointed questions about their appearances bothered the American guests. Almost as a reflex, Leroy made a quick inventory of her own wardrobe, which consisted of white cotton and linen dresses, the colonial uniform of white American and European women, which unfortunately did not include diamonds. She found herself lacking. The awkward conversation continued, with Filipinas asking questions that might have indicated interest, but their faces expressed disappointment in the American woman's appearance. The bombardment of questions, expressions of dissatisfaction, and backhanded compliments paid to Leroy's one accessory, a small gold crown, were acts of aggression, eliciting what CNI calls ugly feelings, insecurity, inadequacy, and jealousy. Nerissa Balse designates the ugly feelings of rage, rancor, and irritability toward the Philippine colony and quote-unquote natives generated during the colonial context as colonial racial affect. These emotions contradicted ideologies of American white supremacy and chipped away at the white American woman's sense of self-importance and confidence and her presumption of superior status. Leroy's admission that there are in fact no diamonds calls attention to her own social class. She and her husband were middle class and therefore of different social and economic status than Filipino elites with whom they rubbed elbows. It's important to understand that the elite hacienderos mentioned in American accounts were some of the most prominent families in the Philippines, and their wealth exceeded that of the Americans. These wealthy land-owning families were connected to global agricultural export industries such as sugar. And Filipino elites displayed their wealth purposely through their clothing, their jewelry, as well as their houses and home decor. Such displays of material wealth also exhibit what they considered their Hispanism and the cosmopolitan nature of their lives. Elites spoke Spanish and were educated in Spanish schools in Manila or sent abroad to universities in Spain and across Europe. Their churches and homes were influenced by Spanish colonial architecture, and they danced Spanish dances at bailes. Their locally embroidered and tailored gowns were made from imported silks from China and India, as well as from luxurious local textiles such as piña. And actually, you can see piña. Jeanne, you use piña, right? So if you want to know what piña looks like, Jeanne's art actually has piña, which is it's a very luxurious
Slippers.
on the slippers.
Yeah.
We call them chanelas, but I know that other people call them like chanclas, right? So you can see what piña looks like. Okay, so women, their hats were purchased in Paris, and women and girls flaunted their dresses as well as their musical skills by playing on imported pianos, and especially German pianos. So at this moment of colonial encounter, Leroy's appearance, which she described as simple, was in sharp contrast to the appearance of these wealthy women. Perceiving the question about her absent diamonds as a threat, the American woman retaliated. She responded to her Filipino host that American women did not bring luxury items with them to the Philippines because we were afraid they would be stolen. The barman countered any suggestion, whether true or not, that American women lacked style and access to material wealth. She also insinuated that American women were not safe in what they characterized as a barbaric and savage place, a direct insult to Filipino elites who sought to demonstrate their civility, refinement, and worldliness as evidence of their capacity to self-govern. Deflecting the threat to her image, oh, I should show pictures. Sorry, I forgot about the text. So you know what they look like. They're very fancy. Okay. The Filipinos' unexpected luxury, wealth, and array of styles elicited a range of reactions from the women of the commission. The realities that American women faced in their individual encounters did not mirror their already formed racialized and gendered conception of white womanhood and Filipiness, and engendered what Minha Pham calls racial resentment. So the tense exchange between the two women laid bare the many hierarchies under which women on both sides of the colonial divide operated. Veiled insults, masquerading as innocent questions, often fall into the realm of feminine social interactions labeled as petty, and therefore considered inconsequential. The curation of appearances, practices of gossip, and the dishing out of insults are treated as petty acts. Pettiness suggests triviality and energy wasted on the inconsequential, as opposed to real and important matters. Concern over personal appearance and material culture is often dismissed as a feminized form of frivolity, and feminized acts of aggression are typically not seen as power moves. But what is the politics of pettiness? Materialistic questions and slights about personal appearance and the very process of curating appearances can be assertive and aggressive acts. And indeed, as Carol Tulak points out, style connotes agency in the instruction of the self and the curation of the assemblages of garments and accessories, hairstyles, and beauty regimes that may or may not be in fashion at the time of use. Filipinas' aggressive presentation of wealth and cosmopolitan fashion prove effective. The performance of elite power structures undermine American assumptions of backwardsness. And if you want to learn more about petty encounters, please read my book. I have a lot of examples of pettiness. I'm happy to talk about them in our conversation. Because pettiness can be very powerful. Just take a look at this side eye. Okay. Really quickly, I just have pictures. So the book takes us through, you're going to see a lot of pettiness and aggression, and the book takes us through different scenes, such as that of beauty pageants, to the making of exploitative Philippine embroidery industry, and one where labor and expertise of Filipinas and communities homeschools that take place in communities and homes, but also schools and prisons, that are used for export commodities for the consumption of American markets, to the making of a high fashion Filipina industry in the years leading up to World War II. And then the book ends with another war on the horizon and being caught between two empires, the United States and Japan. So please read my book. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Well, that was amazing. When I first met Genevieve, that was like one of the first stories she told me. And I was like, oh my goodness, there's so much drama around fashion and like politics. Like, this is insane. But I'll get into that later. I wanted to start my presentation with this painting entitled Under the Same Mosquito Net. And this is the painting that Genevieve mentioned as her initial impression of my work and during COVID and the pandemic. So what you see is my mom and my siblings. I am the little baby. And my mom, growing up, she was like, in America, when you're a baby, parents tell you to put your babies in separate cribs and teach them about independence early on. But my mom was like, in the Philippines, we all slept under the same mosquito net. So my father actually took that photo, and he's a professional photographer. And I just wanted to capture it And this was also early on when I have a huge background with oil painting. So this was one of my first paintings where I'm combining textiles and painting. So what you're viewing is stitched batik fabric and cotton fabric on the bottom half of the painting, and then cotton on top, raw canvas on top, and then oil painting on both. So at the time, I was also inventing this new mythological character for myself, and I refer to her as the Carabao figure, and she's basically a personification of Filipino and American culture. My mom was modeling for me during a time. During this time, she was recently diagnosed with breast cancer. So the Carabao in the Philippines, they're the national animal and represent Filipinos as hardworking and strong. So I kind of wanted to make a painting that was an ode to mothers, especially my mom, and giving her strength during this difficult time. And then it has some of her favorite things. Like my mom loves to cook, and the wooden fork and spoon is very iconic of Filipino kitchens. There's orchids, which are her favorite flower, jasmine plant, and then a prayer plant, which is in her apartment. I feel like we grew up with one always. And again, you see the stitched fabric on the bottom making the tiled floor, and then the painted upper half. So during lockdown, I started getting into tapestry weaving. I think around 2018, 2019, it was becoming a more popular medium. And for me, I have memories of weaving with my dad, like printer paper, like when you shred it. We just had all this excess. And my dad was like, let me show you a cool craft. So we would just sit down in our dining table, and I made this giant paper weaving. But in the art world, especially in the NYU art department, craft and art seemed like very separate things. So if it was craft, it wasn't considered a professional medium or something sophisticated. But as we know, there's a lot of work and labor that goes into it. So yeah, this was my first attempt. I took painting stretcher bars and some nails and said, let me try to figure this out. So after lockdown, I applied for the textile art residency in Brooklyn, and it's a 9-month intense residency where you learn how to weave in different ways using a floor loom or a tapestry loom. And the director of the program, she came up with this idea of pin weaving or shape weaving. So you basically draw out the image you want and then put pins all around it and create your warp and weft. And so this was the first time I did it. And I mentioned the floor loom. So you see my former assistant setting it up for me. And for those of you, is anyone familiar with floor looms actually? Or yeah, a little bit. So floor looms are basically the first computer, and you program it using different shafts and threading each individual thread to create your pattern. And one of my favorite things about weaving is that even though there's this consistent pattern, you still have the ability to manipulate it as you're working on the loom. So what you see here on the right, in one of my pieces in the back corner, you see the window, and this is the process of it. So painting directly on the warp using stencils, and then weaving. Well, I had a video here where you could watch me weave, but this is one of my earlier projects I made last year or this year, and I was weaving a tapestry textile of a vase, but I'll just keep going and process. So the other item I learned about was the domestic knitting machine, and for those of you who knit, usually with knitting needles, you're knitting horizontally, but on the knitting machine, you're knitting vertically, and it's also backwards. So basically, it looks like a giant keyboard with 200 needles on it, and you can manipulate the needles into different positions so that some knit and some don't knit. And there's a lot of math involved, and you have to think a lot about tension and like yarn thickness. So I love this so much because it's like challenges and puzzles. And so for the slipper piece, I created these knitted shadows of floral patterns, and then also the shadows of the figure's feet. And for me, like creating knitted materials in different shapes, it's kind of like creating your own narrative. And, no one makes it, and you'll never see anything else like it. So it's this feeling of having full autonomy over my own narrative. And then, as Genevieve mentioned, there was a lot of embroidery and piña. I wanted to incorporate piña in all the works, but it took 1 month just to do one embroidery. So for Genevieve's book cover, that was actually my first attempt at embroidery. And the crazy thing about it was that my dad's mother, she passed away when I was a baby. She left us with this giant sewing kit, and a lot of the items in it weren't even opened. So for this project, I went to that kit and I was like, oh, I could use this. And it felt like my Lola was giving me something for this project. So that's why it was also very special for me to work with Genevieve. So the hoop you see here in the photo, that was my grandmother's hoop. Sorry. And then this is the result of combining both. So during the process of creating my work, I asked Genevieve to send me photographs of the Manila Queens or the Miss Philippines that she had on file. And I really wanted to incorporate them into my work, but it felt a little conflicting because I don't have a personal connection to them. And so I was trying to think about different ways of acknowledging this history without directly centering it. I'll bring it up more in the other slides. So these two slides are from my mom's photo album when she was a teenager. And she brings them out every once in a while because they're like locked away in storage. But whenever I see them, I'm just like, wow, you look just like me. And the pattern, I don't know why I was drawn to the pattern of the photo album, but it just seemed very iconic of my mother's photo album. So in the piece on the show, Family Reunion, Ring Around the Rosie, you see that striped pattern repeated in the background, referencing Family Archive. And then in this image, you see me as a little girl playing Ring Around the Rosie with my older sister and my cousin. So in my family, there's large age gaps and generational gaps. So whenever we come together as a family, like it just feels natural, but like even though we're all so different, and I thought that was something very special about my family. And going back to like referencing the beauty queens without directly centering them, I was very interested in their accessories. And in the original photo where me and my sister and cousin are playing Ring Around the Rosie, there is a fan on the wall, and I just replaced that fan with this fan of the Miss Philippines, Anita Noble of Batangas, and she's the first National Beauty Contest winner during the Manila Carnival in 1926. And then the photograph you see on the left image, the portrait, that's my mom's family and my grandparents. And my mom and her siblings were the first of their generation to graduate from college. So it was also this very iconic image of success and origins, and a good reminder of knowing where I was from. So this piece is very special to me. It's a portrait of me and my mom linking arms. And it was just casually one evening we were sitting down. And then I don't know why my mom, she just wanted to link arms with me. I'm like, why are you touching me? But it was a very beautiful moment for me. I think it was also during a time when my mom's eldest brother had passed away. So I think in my family, this feeling of like time is fleeting and moments are precious, especially with your elders. It was something that was constantly on my mind. And I wanted to make this painting about that. And then I also think a lot about my relationship with my mom as synonymous to my relationship to the Philippines. So I'm a second generation and I've never been to the Philippines. So if like seeing the arms intertwine makes me think about how this, I'm kind of like the legacy of my mom and her stories and this culture, and I feel like I'm barely holding on because maybe in future generations might not know how to speak Tagalog or cook Filipino food, and it's just not the same. And also, we're wearing dusters. Sorry, the title is Relaxing in Our Dusters, which is like a traditional like household relaxing dress. Yeah. And then manicures. So me and my eldest sister, we have a 7-year gap, and we used to share a room growing up. So in the late 90s, early 2000s, we always had posters of Britney Spears and the Spice Girls and Sailor Moon. And my sister loved painting my nails, so this was something that I wanted to capture. And I didn't necessarily want this painting to be about me wanting to look white, even though during that time you saw so much white representation in media. So I always grew up wondering, what would it look like if I were one of these celebrities? I don't know if I have a close-up. Oh no, sorry, let me go back. Well, I mean, you could see the piece in person, but I photoshopped features of like my nose and my mouth onto Britney Spears and like Ashley Olsen. Sorry, not Ashley Simpson. And then like for the Spice Girls, I just cut out their faces and replaced them with my own. So it's also kind of this fun play of this little girl imagining what her adult self would be like. And then on the table, so in Genevieve's book, she talks a lot about like advertisements from the Philippines, and this is the earliest, or one of the earliest Vogue issues. I want to say 1906. And the cool thing about Vogue Online is that they have the archive of all of their magazines. Mm-hmm. So I was able to find the one Q&A that Genevieve mentions in her book, where if you see kind of in the center of the left column, it's like wardrobe for the Philippines. And some of the questions were just so hilarious. Like, what would you advise for a young matron? Wait, what does it say? Sorry. For a young matron's wardrobe for traveling to the Philippines and going about while there. I leave in late autumn and should like to know just what would be required. My husband is in the army there, and I shall be stationed at a small post with him until the spring, when I shall return. I shall be near Manila and shall be entertained by the families and other officers there. What hats shall I require? What are the necessary items for the trip? And then it just goes on and on about breaking down what outfits and accessories to bring to the Philippines, and just getting a Western perspective at that time is hilarious, especially as a Filipino American bringing that to light. But then again, like in this painting, the sisters are painting their nails on top of that article too. So it's like they're kind of disregarding it, and they want to keep their tables clean. So it's like, I don't know, I was really excited about including that. And then I'll just end my talk talking about the book cover and a little bit about the process. So again, this is just the early stages of my first embroidery. And then you see like the painting underneath the embroidery on the right. And then you start seeing it become more developed, and finally the final result at the very end. But I will say, I think we spent maybe a year talking about the book cover and what we wanted. And initially I was like, Genevieve, what if I put my water buffalo figure? And she was like, no, Jeanne, like bodies matter in this book. I think we should center it around them.
Yeah.
But I mean, one thing that Genevieve and I both agreed on with this cover is that the silhouette of the woman's face, like she has the flat nose, and that's very iconic for both of us, for Filipinos. Mm-hmm. And it was also, we wanted something moody. I think that's what we said.
We said moody,
so,
for sure.
Yeah, so that's that. So thank you very much.
So I just want to give you insight into how Jeanne and I communicate. And so we're just going to have a conversation to kind of delve into the pieces that you got to see, and then also about the work, to kind of give you insight into what it's like to work with an artist. I feel incredibly privileged to have been introduced to you and to be able to have worked alongside with you for a really long time. And actually I was talking to one of my colleagues, and that's actually pretty rare in academic publishing. And to be able to kind of have that artistic freedom and to have your cover be something that really represents like what you envisioned the book to be. So, and then to have an incredible artist, I feel like you brought so many things that I imagined to life, and then also it took on a life of its own, and it kind of surpassed anything that I could have dreamed of. So, so as we kind of move into, we had like determined questions, but I also wanted to like bring up Jeanne, and then maybe just for folks to kind of have insight into how we like talked and stuff. Like, do you remember when we were talking, and then I said like, okay, bodies matter, and then I said, actually somebody told me that you have to have like people, like a person on the okay. So then I was like, oh, somebody told me, this person is in the room, I don't know if she's gonna remember telling me this, that not only do bodies matter in the book, but also it's really important to have bodies on your cover because that's what sells. So I took it really seriously. Yeah, because of course it sells. And I was like, oh my God, there's so many layers to this. But you had shown me different ideas. And then, do you remember that day where I came to your studio after we talked?
Well, I remember, so Genevieve walked into my studio and immediately she starts crying. And I was like, are you crying? Like, what? And she's like, you have no idea how like emotional this is for me. And I had like a very like difficult year. So I was like over my head. I was so burnt out from previous shows. Yeah. And I was also feeling negatively about myself and my practice.
Oh, I had no idea.
So, yeah, seeing your reaction, I was like, whoa, like my work matters to someone. And, you know, that was very eye-opening for me too.
Yeah.
But yeah, then we sat down and I went through all my different sketches.
And then you told me, you were like, I have a favorite, but I'm not going to tell you which one is my favorite. And then I was like, oh God, this is pressure. I hope we land on the same one. And then there were 4 sketches. And then I was like, okay, 2 of them are the ones I'm thinking of. And then you didn't say anything, and you just kind of smiled. I was like, oh God, this is so scary. And then we landed on her. And then you told me, you were like, that's my favorite one.
Yeah. I wish I had the original sketch I showed you, because it was way more like loose, and I think the background was like purple, and I was like, it's gonna be a different color, and there's gonna be more details here. Just trust it. But yeah, it worked out.
It totally worked out. And then I think we talked about details, like, if I don't know if you noticed in the background. So she's over there in the corner when you want to see her. But there are dark palm tree leaves in the background and waves. Right. And we talked about, like, how can we also evoke space and, like, time and, like, the Philippines. And then we thought about having, like, sampaguita. And, like, sampaguita is, like, it's kind of like a Philippine jasmine. But then we decided, like, that's not moody. Like, sampaguita is, like, actually really pretty and smells beautiful. So it was just a lot of talking back and forth between us. And Jeanne, when you got the piña, and she texted me a photograph, and she's like, I got this roll of piña. And it's like, do you think you could describe what the material felt like to you when you got it?
Oh my goodness. Well, I mean, also just growing up, like, being around piñas, like, you never touch it, you never expose it to light or air so much, and because it's, like, very difficult to wash. And when I first got my sheets of piña, it kind of felt like holding spider webs in a way. Yeah. And again, like, this is my first time interacting with the material as a medium I would use for my art. So I was so nervous, because even as I was embroidering, threads were starting to come off. And I think you also had to use a specific type of thread for the embroidery. And my mom, she took home economics, so she knew exactly the materials I needed. And she was like, you can't just use that crappy cotton, you need the cotton pearl. And I was like, okay, it makes sense. But much of the way that I was learning, it was just through photographs. There's not really a lot of video documentation of Filipino bordaderas.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I think that, I mean, that's incredible that it's your mom that also passed on the knowledge to you, because it speaks to the way that history can get passed on through both memory and material culture, especially if that history is erased. And I think for me, what really struck me about you including piña as part of the piece was, and actually witnessing what you had to go through, and so is to also appreciate the kind of skill that it takes to create something so beautiful. And that was something that you and I had talked a lot about, because I got to go into Jeanne's studio and see her weaving and her looms, and like, yeah, I was crying for sure. And but it kind of, you know, it's one thing to read about it in the archive, and then it's my task to try to, like, bring it to life through text. And then it was another thing for Jeanne to bring it to life for me through action and material, and to, like, actually witness the labor. And, like, I think you had Band-Aids.
Oh, really?
Probably. And then also, you know, like, she would tell me about how many hours it would take just for, like, a tiny piece. And it made me, it just sort of reaffirmed what I knew about the historical agents in my book, that that this is, like, their bodies and their souls and their skill, that and artistry that is not always appreciated, you know. And so, like, here you are, like, sort of doing that work and, like, bringing it to life.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very physical. I mean, there are a lot of hours that go by, and then at the end of the day, I'm like, wow, my back really hurts. And I don't know. I mean, it's also really nice talking to Genevieve and like other people who have an appreciation for textiles, because nowadays we take it for granted. It's very easy to make fabric, but it's also everyone has their own way of interacting with fabric. So now, like, whenever I go shopping, I'm like, I need to see what material this is made out of. Is this going to be easy to wash?
Yeah.
Like, that
Do you
kind
touch
of
it?
thing. Yeah, I touch it.
Yeah.
And I'm like, does this feel good on my skin? And if it doesn't, I, like, avoid it,
Yeah.
even if it's really pretty.
Right.
Yeah.
And just for folks to know, piña, if you speak Spanish, piña literally means pineapple. And so it's sort of shorthand because it's made out of pineapple fiber. And it's as much as it's hard to like embroider on, it's also equally as hard to create. So, which is why it's such a luxurious fabric, so luxurious that I couldn't afford to buy a piña dress for today. So I think I want to pull back a little bit, Jeanne, and talk about sort of the larger sort of larger questions about our work. And so I wanted to ask you, I mean, you talk a little bit about it in your presentation when you talk about family, and you talk about being Filipino American, but I wondered if you could elaborate a little bit more on what led you to focus on Filipinx narratives, and if you can kind of walk us through that a little.
Yeah. So the origin story is kind of like an eye roll for me. So back when Trump was like first elected for presidency, you know, there's a lot of anti-Asian hate, a lot of marginalized identities being attacked. And I was painting a lot of landscapes at the time, abstract landscapes, but I was always very shy to expose me and my family. You know, it's very intimate. But it felt like a moment for me to start thinking about what matters most to me and try to bring that to my work. So I learned through it that not a lot of people know much about Filipino history, myself included. And I thought this would also be a way for me to learn more about my ancestors. My grandparents all passed away when I was a baby. So if I understood the history, then I could better understand where I come from and who I am. So that was initially like the genesis of it. And I was doing my own personal research a lot, and you know, there's not a lot of information about Filipino Americans as well. So when I met Genevieve, I was like, oh, you know all the stuff that I've been trying to figure out for years. And she was just so open about sharing all of her knowledge. And also to note about the Manila Carnival Queens, I came across that research when I was looking up nurses and the emigration of Philippine nurses to America. And there was this one photograph that was like, Filipina nurses at the Manila Carnival. And I was like, what's the Manila Carnival? Yeah. And then, again, not finding that much information. So when Genevieve was like, oh, I'm writing a book about the Manila Carnival Queens. And I was like, what? So it was very exciting. What was the question? Did I answer?
Yeah, you definitely answered
Okay.
it. Like, how did you get to telling Filipinx stories?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll also turn the question around, what made you want to write a book about beauty pageants and the Carnival Queens and
I mean,
the politics.
The politics of it. Yeah. I mean, I tell this, so, I mean, I think in academia, it's kind of frowned upon to look at something that's personal. I think for folks, for those of us in ethnic studies, like we get sort of questioned about that a lot, and I always think like that's so weird. Like why? Like you don't have to study something that's personal to you, but I definitely don't think it's like a ding to study that which is personal. And so as I mentioned, I'm Hetty and I'm a Scorpio. So I think when people tell me you can't do something, it makes me want to do it more. But I think that, you know, I was just like, I grew up in a huge predominantly Filipino area, and so I knew that, and I felt really super comfortable in my Filipino identity. But like you, I didn't really know that much about the history, other than like stories that my dad told me, which is like, I don't know. When my dad tells me stories, I'm like, is that true? I don't know. And he's like a really great storyteller, but loves to elaborate. And so I think like part of it was like out of spite and like anger, which is also how I completed graduate school, was like out of spite and anger. But I like just kind of knew that I wanted to do something on Filipino women. And when I was like doing coursework like in ethnic studies and Asian American studies, like we learned so much about like what our world is today and who we are today comes from legacies of colonialism. And I understood that, and it made a lot of sense, but I wanted to know like what was the legacy, so like I wanted to add to that history of like what is colonialism and how does colonialism function, and like if colonialism and empire is so insidious, like where can you locate it? Like can you locate it in the obvious of the brutality, but also the sort of insidious of like of the everyday. And so I was looking for that, and then I was like, oh, okay, I'm going to go into an archive, and I didn't know what an archive was, and so I was just like, oh, I'll just cast the net wide, and then there are sort of like two things I was drawn to, which is food, because I like to eat, and then the other thing was beauty, because I saw these like beauty pageant pictures, and I was like, what is this? Like, who are these like fabulous women with their big crowns? And I grew up watching a lot of beauty pageants. That was like family bonding, it was like Laker games and like Miss Universe. And so, and then my advisor told me, oh, Genevieve, you have to choose. Like, you can't do beauty and food. That's too big. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to do beauty and fashion. So that's kind of how it came to it. And then I told him, I was like, I don't want to do the history of capitalism. I don't want to do history of labor. I just want to do like visual culture and stuff. And he was like, try it. So my dissertation was like that. But then my book ended up being a history of labor and capitalism because I couldn't escape it. So, so I think like part of it is intentionality, but also part of it is just like I stumbled upon a lot of things, and actually, in fact, like, the pictures that I sent you of the beauty queens, that comes from somebody's personal collection in the Philippines. He lives in Taguig in Global City, and he just has like a private library. I think he used to be a nurse in the States, and then he retired in Manila. And what he does is he just lets anybody do research. You just have to Facebook message him, and then you go. He's like, you kind of tell him what you're looking for, and then he'll pull stuff for you in his like beautiful condo. And then all you have and the one thing he requires from you is you have to sit down and have merienda with him. You have to have like an afternoon meal and just talk to him, and that's it. So it was just like super intimate, like people would just share things and stuff. And so yeah, so I was just really struck by, I was like, oh, it's like so many layers of intimacy happening here.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. I think I wanted to ask you to, like, now that we're talking about intimacy, when you talked about the piece, with the dusters and your mother and you holding hands, which, like, to me was so incredibly moving. And then the one piece of, it looks like a family party that's going to be set up, and I was oh, this is so familiar. And then just sort of like the close up of like touching and like different body parts and different relationships. I wanted to know if you could just say a little bit more about that, because your work is so filled with love. My work is not filled with love. Like, my work is like about like destruction. So I wanted to know if you could kind of talk a little bit more about that.
Sure, yeah. Well, this also piggybacks off of your earlier question about why I make work about Filipino Americans or myself. And a large part of it was in undergrad, I took an Asian American Pacific Island Studies class. And I remember seeing like political cartoons in the early 1900s of like Uncle Sam disciplining the newly acquired lands that were personified as children or savages. And I wanted to reclaim that in my work. So the intimacies that are presented are more so like humanizing the Filipino image, and it's more in response to those images of Western depictions, but also trying not to fall into that pigeonhole of stereotypical Filipino images. I think growing up, I didn't have a huge Filipino community, so I wasn't familiar with like a lot of, I don't know, the customs or the dances. A lot of that was learned a lot later in life. So I was trying to pick images that reminded me more about this combination of being both American and Filipino. And my entire practice is about how do I make this tangible, like, because a lot of people have mixed identities, and it's hard to pinpoint what it is. You usually have to choose one or the other. So my work is more so about creating this interesting mix of both of them. And then also trying to bring back traditional patterns and practices into the present. But I also, when I was making these works, I was thinking a lot about one of the sections in Genevieve's book where she talks about intimacies between different races, specifically the Filipino women creating lingerie and embroideries for white women in America, and that kind of relationship. So for me, it felt very like groundbreaking and even more emotional that I am a Filipino American woman making work about Filipinos and Filipino Americans. Like, I can take back that power and give it back to my people. So for a good example of that, I would say, going back to the piña slippers, the whole concept behind that, I was trying to think about what's the Filipino Cinderella slipper. And growing up, the Filipina elders would wear these Chinese slippers in my building specifically. And so I wanted to create the piña version of it, giving back that wealth and that status to the women who raised me and to feel beautiful as a Filipino woman.
Yeah. Oh my God, that's so incredibly moving. I mean, especially because if you look at the historical record, the way Americans write about chanelas, it's always in this very disparaging way, like the way that the chanelas makes click-clack sounds, like, and it becomes a way of like surveilling Filipino bodies, like, you know, that they're on the way, and then you made it into something that's like really beautiful and like so delicate, and but like at the same time really strong, you know, and it just, so it totally undermines a lot of that what we see in the record. I think to kind of close, sorry, we're not gonna have time for a Q&A for everybody else who just to ask us questions on the internet, because I just care about what we say to each other. So I think to close is, I wanted to ask, or maybe if we could talk a little bit about the theme about beauty, and to think about the word maganda, and if you could kind of articulate a little bit, you know, why call it Unbeing Maganda, why call the One Piece Maganda, and what does like beauty mean for you and your collection of work and doing this process?
So I guess it kind of like, this might sound a little redundant again, but thinking about beauty through like intimate moments with my family and the intergenerational relationships I had growing up. I mean, as a kid, I wasn't excited about being Filipino, or again, I wasn't around Filipino communities. So it wasn't until a lot later that I started embracing this concept of maganda, which is, it's beauty, but it's also like beauty of, or no, like the
totally.
mind. I don't
no, that's
like,
so true.
right,
It's like when you say, oh, ang ganda, like it's like it's something to behold that's beautiful. But when you say somebody is maganda, it's also like their personhood is really beautiful. So it's also like your
the
status.
accomplished woman.
Yeah. Like, oh, are you educated? Ay, ang ganda. Like, you know, or like your like character, right? And then like, and so it has like it's not just like, it's aesthetic, but it has such a deep meaning for us.
Right, yeah. And again, like the images, I didn't want to choose images that were specifically like women in dresses and looking elegant. Like these are very raw, intimate snapshots into my childhood and like personal memories. Yeah, I mean, the title just sort of wraps it all up in one ribbon.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I really appreciate that. I think I think beauty is so complicated, and I think like it's so, we talk a lot about it as Filipinos, and it's like so pervasive in so many ways, but it has, I think, like for non-Filipinos, it's hard to describe the complications of beauty, and I think for me, it became this really important vehicle to be able to like express not only something that is so central to like our everyday lives, but also this sort of framework that allows us to talk about people, like personality, personhood, but also material culture, and this larger systems of economics and politics, and it just kind of was able to encapsulate a lot of so many complicated things that I think, like, I hope that the book does. I think it does. I think it does pretty well. But read it. But I know for sure your art does it. So I think I want to say that it is such a privilege, again, to have been able to work with you. I was a little sad when, like, I felt like, oh, we're done, you know?
Yeah, I know.
And I think, you know, what I like about what we both do is like our stuff is out in the world and we can help, you know, and carry on those conversations. But we are especially lucky because your art is going to be up here in the new house for quite a bit of time. So I think students, faculty, community, and friends, like, we're so lucky to have Jeanne's work here. So what you can do is buy my book and then read it alongside. And then I think Professor Mata, we have some treats, right? So should we close now, or?
Thank you so much for making it.
I know. Do you want to give the knife to the Scorpio?
I have to take a photo.
Oh my gosh.
So before we cut the cake, I do want to acknowledge two very important guests that we have tonight, and that's Amelia and Anthony Jalandoni. Oh, she said she's the right. Before we begin with the cake, I did want to acknowledge two very, very important guests that we have here tonight, and that's Amelia and Anthony Jalandoni.
Yeah.
Should we cut the cake like a wedding?
Should we feed each other? No, I think you
Thanks, everybody. I'm going to cut really fast the cake. I'm going to try.
Yeah.
Give me directions.
No, just cut it.
Just start cutting?
Yeah, just
Here we go, guys. Yay. So sad to cut her.
I know, yeah.
Yeah. Students, especially, thank you all for coming. Please grab some cake to go. It was really wonderful to see you all here.
Have you ever had a book date?